Despite there being some concerns, Jerome Tang would be an exciting hire for the Louisville men's basketball program. We'll break it down as to why on today's episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast. Stay tuned.
You are Locked On Louisville, your daily podcast on the Louisville Cardinals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? Welcome into another episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast. I'm your host, Dalton Pence. Today's episode brought to you by LinkedIn. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. That's why LinkedIn Jobs helps find the right people for your team faster and for free. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Terms and conditions apply. And as always, I want to personally thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. Just a reminder, the Locked On Louisville podcast is free on all streaming services 5 days a week. Your team every day. Today's episode of the show, we break down the candidacy for Kansas State head basketball coach Jerome Tang as it relates to the open Louisville job. We'll start out by explaining why it's hard to tell if Tang is a legitimate candidacy or a legitimate candidate in this search for athletic director Josh Hurd. We'll explain why the ceiling is high and why he would be an exciting hire for the program, while also acknowledging some of the legitimate concerns that surround hiring Jerome Tang. It is Selection Sunday, so we're still waiting to see what the fate of the Kansas State Wildcats is later this evening. This is being recorded at about 11:30 a.m. Eastern time on Sunday. So for a good portion of the fan base, you're likely going to be viewing, watching, listening to this after the selection show. And I don't necessarily know the fate of the team, but it seems like at this point in time, Kansas State's season is possibly over. They are in Joe Lunardi's next 4 out on his bracketology. So barring something unexpected, even with the resume that Kansas State has, I think that it's probably going to be the end of the season for Jerome Tang in his second season in Manhattan. This has been his first head coaching job, took over Kansas State last year, took them to an Elite Eight in his first season, had some issues in the offseason with a player getting dismissed from the team, and Kansas State had sort of a letdown year, being 19-14, but had some highs, had some lows. Tang has been included by a good portion of social media in this search. Unfortunately, with the way that this search is going and how close to chest athletic director Josh Hurd is keeping information, it's all speculation at this point. There are some people that will tell you, well, Jerome Tang is a possible candidate for this job. And then there's others that will say, nope, he is not 100% not a candidate for this job. So it's a lot of he said, she said at the moment. And I think I have to clarify my method of discussing candidates on this show, because people have asked, well, if you're talking about Dusty May, he must be a legitimate candidate. You discussed Mick Cronin, he must be a legitimate candidate. Will Wade also. Scott Drew. I said early on, even before this coaching search started, that if a coach, if insert coach here, if his name was discussed at least a couple of times for this job, whether it be on social media or from the local radio or from the national media, we're going to talk about that coach on this show. And one of the reasons why is we'll talk about how legitimate of an option said coach is. If he is a possible candidate, maybe a rumored favorite like Dusty May, we'll tell you that. But if he is not a potential candidate like Will Wade, potentially like Jerome Tang, we'll explain that as well. I think it's key to be able to discuss both ends of the argument, because that paints a picture of who Louisville could be looking at. Unfortunately, outside of the Cardinals prioritizing Scott Drew, I think everything after that is completely speculation. there might be truth to what some people say, but it's hard to decipher, what the truth actually is, who actually is going to be in the know here, because Josh Hurd keeps things so close to chest. So it's hard to tell if Tang is going to be a legitimate candidate. I think if he is, it's probably going to be after Scott Drew, after Dusty May. I think he's in this group with guys like Mick Cronin. I don't want to put Josh Scherz or Pat Kelsey in this group either, but I think he's probably right on the same level of Mick Cronin, although Cronin might be a little bit ahead. I think in the pecking order of things, I would guess he's probably around 4th to 5th. And if Scott Drew turns down the job, I think that there is an opportunity for Tang to be included in the mix. So I say all that to say that I truly don't know at this time, and I don't think a lot of people know. There's conflicting reports. Pete Thamel said on College Game Day yesterday that he thinks that Louisville could go after a guy like Jerome Tang. Now, like I said, he thinks, keyword being thinks, but it's all speculation. So would Jerome Tang take the job? I think 100% he would. I think that with the controversy in the late fall when Naquan Tomlin was dismissed from the program by the president, there was it seemed like there was some tension in Manhattan. Many people said, yeah, Jerome Tang's going to look to get out of Dodge in this situation. But Tang came out and tried to smooth things over. Whether or not that was a PR stunt or if he truly believed that, no way of telling. But it seemed like there were tensions between Kansas State's administration and the basketball program, rightfully so, with the program losing arguably was going to be one of the top players on the team in the 2023-24 season. So there's that issue. And couple that, now I don't know how large of a dissonance there is at the moment, but it can't hurt Louisville's case if Louisville were to want to go after Tang. Cardinals program is a better program than Kansas State. I think that speaks for itself. No disrespect to Kansas State, who has been better since 2018, which it's really not hard to be better than Louisville since 2018. 1 tournament appearance, potentially 2 if you want to factor in 2020, but nobody went to the tournament that year. Louisville's the better program. And I say this with no disrespect to Kansas State. It makes a lot of sense as to why Tang would leave a program like Kansas State to come to Louisville, with Louisville being a top 6 to 7 job in college basketball, in my opinion. So from a desire standpoint, Tang likely would make the move. Financially speaking, he made about $3 million this season. His contract increases $100,000 each year until 2029-2030 season, so he'll get up to 3.6. You look at what Kenny Payne was making, and it makes a ton of sense. Louisville, if the numbers are true, that they can offer Scott Drew anywhere in the ballpark of 8 to 8.5, maybe even $9 million annual, it would make sense for the Cardinals to throw a little bit of a pay increase at Jerome Tang, and it would be hard to turn that down. One thing I find interesting is the $6 million buyout that Tang has, that will, I think, drop $1 million on April 30th, but Louisville doesn't have the luxury of waiting that long with relation to the transfer portal. So you would have to essentially pay that $6 million buyout, which I wonder what Scott Drew's buyout is. I've seen different numbers. Baylor is a private institution, so it's really hard to tell. But I think that paying upwards of $10 million is probably where Josh Hurd draws a line in the sand. However, I think $6 million is definitely an option, especially since you would probably be paying him around Kenny Payne money, and it would make sense. But from a logistical standpoint, financially speaking, if Louisville wanted Jerome Tang, I think that the Cardinals would get him. I don't think it would be that big of an issue. I know that Kansas State has some NIL backing, which is fantastic in Manhattan. I think Louisville will show that they have one of the better NIL infrastructures in college basketball here in the next couple of seasons. They've got the facilities, they've got the fan base, and they've got one of the top jobs in college basketball. But I do still respect Kansas State. I just think if Louisville came calling, it's a hard job for him to say no unless, he feels like he still has a job to do in Manhattan. But if you wonder how much does the whole issue with the president play into Tang's decision, that is to be determined. And not to mention, it's easier to coach in the ACC at the moment than the Big 12 because the Big 12 has been absolutely electric. Kansas State wasn't terrible this year. Their resume is pretty decent, but they're 19-14 because they play in a very, very tough conference. But I'm going to tell you, some people don't believe so. I think Jerome Tang would be an exciting hire for the Cardinals program. There's a lot of great things when it comes to Jerome Tang, and the ceiling is high. I'm going to explain why you should be excited for a potential Jerome Tang hire here momentarily after we talk about our friends over at Nissan. This week's March Madness Bracket Highlight is brought to you by our friends at Nissan. Each week, we are picking one team that stands out, a team that's pushed it further than the rest. This week's team is the Utah State Aggies. Obviously, this week's Nissan Rogue, the team absolutely surprised us all with the powerful performance against New Mexico, giving them their first outright Mountain West title in program history. They say, win life, go Rogue. And that's exactly what the Aggies have done. Take the Nissan Rogue, Nissan Pathfinder, or Nissan Armada and go find your next big adventure. Shop NissanUSA.com. Also want to take this time to tell you about our friends over at Amazon Fire TV. Fire TV is your destination for sports, from live games to highlights to in-depth analysis. The reason why I chose Fire TV is the Fire TV Channels app. It allows you to have a constant supply of the latest videos from your favorite sports brands, all for free. It also includes all of us at Locked On and most of the big pro leagues and college conferences as well. Allows you to dive into all of the game analysis, highlights, and more to keep up to date on all of the latest in the world of sports, March Madness, NBA, and soon to be MLB. If you haven't checked out the Fire TV Channels app, you should. Trust me on this. To learn more, visit www.amazon.com/LockedOnFireTV. Cardinal fans, welcome back to this episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast. Just a reminder, the Locked On College Basketball Breakdown Show is now available on the Locked On College Basketball podcast. Experts Andy Patton and Isaac Shade will break down their brackets and discuss everything that you need to know to fill out a winning bracket and prepare for this year's NCAA tournament. Find the Locked On Bracket Breakdown now on the Locked On College Basketball channel and wherever you get your podcasts. I know that Jerome Tang might not be included in this year's NCAA tournament, but make no mistake about it, if the Cardinals were to hire the Kansas State head men's basketball coach, I think it would be a very exciting hire because the ceiling is high here. For starters, Jerome Tang is one of the most likable coaches in college basketball. Look, when you see rival programs, and I've seen many Kansas fans, Baylor fans, Iowa State fans say, hate Kansas State, love Jerome Tang, wish he would take a different job. That speaks volumes as to how likable of a guy Tang is. And when you watch a press conference, when you watch an interview, it's really not that hard to understand why he is such a likable dude. In all matter, he just gets it. From an expectation standpoint, from just a life standpoint, he has been one of the key player development personnel at Baylor when he took over the assistant coach rank in 2003, became an associate head coach, I think in 2017. But he's a guy that all of his players love. They respect him. Because he loves and respects them. It's a two-way street in terms of respect, and he understands that. He obviously is a player's coach. People like him, but he still knows when to get under a player's skin and drive them to be the best player in person that they can be. When you watch his press conferences, it makes you almost want to hire him on spot. He is an extremely great orator, speaks well, gets his message off really clearly to where people understand it in terms of interpretation, to where, sometimes a coach will say something and you're like, that's just coach speak, or wait, what? What did you mean by that? It's like they run circles around, what they're trying to say. Jerome Tang is a great speaker. He is an extremely great motivator as well. And like I said, it makes me want to run through a brick wall, and I'm not even a Kansas State fan. So he articulates expectations and reiterates them. He demands accountability, but he also is an advocate for his players. And I think that those three things are key as to why he is such a likable guy. He's got a fire about him, just a very infectious personality that people really gravitate towards, and a lot of fan bases across the country like him. So from that aspect, I think that he would be able to connect with the media here, connect with the fan base, connect with the donors, and have a press conference that would light this city up to where you would get on board pretty quickly. Obviously, wins and losses is what matters, but I think he would get a lot of the fan base very early on. When it comes to player development, he was one of the key personnel in player development at Baylor, tasked with that responsibility, and he developed a good amount of players. Spent almost 2 decades down in Waco with Scott Drew, and had a lasting effect on that program. You can tell now by his absence. Was known for his player development, knew what motivated players, knew what helped get them better. So the player development aspect of things is fantastic. Defensively, he is elite. We saw that at Kansas State. Year 1 was fantastic. One thing that I found pretty interesting is that you look at Baylor over the past couple of seasons, and they've always had pretty good defenses. What happened when Jerome Tang left? Well, the Baylor Bears were outside of the top 100 in defensive efficiency the year that Jerome Tang left. Call it for what you will, but that is pretty significant. So I think that is writing on the wall as to how Baylor's defense was so good, is that Jerome Tang was probably the mastermind behind it. And that's translated over to Kansas State. Last year, they were very good. This year, they're not as good defensively, but they're pretty damn good as well. So top 10 in defensive efficiency. They don't allow a lot of touches in the paint. They are a team that plays with a ton of passion and a ton of fire on both ends of the court. And I think that that's one of the trademarks for Jerome Tang, is that he's able to install a culture, and it's able to be installed very quickly. So the culture aspect makes a ton of sense for the Cardinals if they were to hire him. This season wasn't necessarily all the greatest. They were 19-14, but they lost one of, if not their most important player, Naquan Tomlin, before the season. He got dismissed from the program. They had a very tough out-of-conference schedule. They had 5 quad 1 wins, 6 wins against the top 40 in the net, and played in a very tough Big 12 conference. 19-14 isn't ideal, but it's not your regular 19-14. I even think resume-wise, Kansas State would probably be probably logical to include them. But he has some issues on the offensive end, but Jerome Tang is 12-0 in overtime as the coach of Kansas State, so he's able to make those adjustments. He has shown throughout his brief stint in Manhattan that he is adaptable to his team. What's not working, he will change it, so he is not stubborn in his ways. Just an absolutely elite players coach. Before his first season, Kansas State was 14-17, hadn't had a winning season in 3 years, hadn't had over 14 wins in 3 years. Bruce Weber got fired, and Jerome Tang immediately increased the wins by 12, went 26-10, lost in the Elite Eight, barely, to Florida Atlantic. So the first season, you're able to take the team to the Elite Eight, get a 3 seed in the conference tournament, or the conference tournament, NCAA tournament. So you can say, well, Marquise Noel got this team to where they were through his hero ball. Sure, sometimes it takes that hero ball to advance in the tournament, but they were still a 3 seed. So it goes to show you how good they were in the regular season in a very, very good conference. He was the Big 12 Conference Coach of the Season. So there's a ton of benefits as to why you would want a guy like Jerome Tang in Louisville. He would be an exciting hire. The ceiling is high. I think he could be a coach that could project to be a national championship coach. The benefits and the pros are extremely legitimate. However, the concerns are legitimate as well. Tang is not the youngest coach. The track record isn't necessarily there as a head coach and more. So we're going to address some of the concerns here momentarily after we talk about our friends and the title sponsor of the show, LinkedIn Jobs. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. It's not just another job board. LinkedIn has a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals, which makes it the best place to hire. It gives you access to professionals you can't find anywhere else, and LinkedIn does all that while making the process easy and intuitive. Hiring is easy when you have that many quality candidates. So easy that, in fact, 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. I think there's a lot of pros when it comes to hiring a guy like Jerome Tang. Jerome Tang is a fantastic players coach. He is great in terms of one thing I also didn't mention, recruiting. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that. Sorry for taking some time, but Jerome Tang also a great recruiter in the transfer portal. And I think that comes with being a solid players coach is that players want to play for Jerome Tang. Arthur Kaluma, Tyler Perry, the list goes on. I think that, he is a very, very solid recruiter that would do well with this NIL. So sorry for not mentioning that in the benefits category. So if you get on me for not mentioning recruiting, please pay attention to the third segment of the show. But the third segment is dedicated to the concerns side of things. For starters, Jerome Tang is not a young coach. He's 57 years old, which when people talked about Eric Musselman and company, we talked about the age and why it wouldn't really make a lot of sense from an age standpoint. But I also think that you could probably get close to a decade out of guys like Musselman and Tang, but he's not as young as a coach like Dusty May, who's 47, or Will Wade, who's 41, right? So it does make you wonder, well, what's the longevity looking like for a coach like Tang, like Musselman, who are both in their late 50s? Kenny Payne, also not the youngest guy, so you can make the case that, well, you were wanting to hire Kenny Payne, so why not hire Jerome Tang as well? Potentially a very solid point. Another thing that I look at is the lack of a track record here as a head coach. This is his second season as a Power 5 head coach. There would be some level of concern hiring a guy like Tang because he just doesn't have the head coaching experience. You could say, well, last year was maybe a flash in the pan, and this year is more so the thing of what to expect. And honestly, you can't fault people for thinking that because with 2 years of head coaching experience, it's either one or the other. Would his teams be more like year one, where you had guys like Keontae Johnson and Marquise Noel, or is it more like year two, where you go 19-14 and you're on the bubble for the NCAA tournament? I don't think it's that, cut and dry. I think you have to look at context in that situation because of how tough the Big 12 was this year. You lose Naquan Tomlin, which you could also make the case that every single team has dealt with injuries and has dealt with personnel issues. So one could say, sorry, you can't really use that to an excuse because you still have guys like Tyler Perry, like Cam Carter, like Arthur Kaluma, etc. So There's the lack of a track record and viewing last year as a flash in the pan. Yes, they were a 3 seed, but Marquise Noel caught fire in the postseason and won Kansas State some close games, and that has sparked people to wonder, well, was the Elite Eight run a fluke? Like Florida Atlantic, was their Final Four run a fluke? I think you would probably say that Florida Atlantic run is the more of a fluke than Kansas State's, because Florida Atlantic was a 9 seed, Kansas State was a 3 seed, so they at least did something in the regular season. Age, lack of a track record, lack of the overall postseason success. I think the main thing that worries me about a guy like Jerome Tang is the offensive side of the basketball. Jerome Tang, elite defensive coach. I think one thing that worries me is the same thing that worries me about a guy like Mick Cronin. The same thing that worries me on the other end of the court for a guy like Dusty May is that you're very solid on one side of the court, but it would take hiring a good offensive coordinator to be very good offensively, because when you look at Kansas State's offense the past couple of years, they've been able to score the basketball, and this year they're, I think, top 50 in offensive efficiency, so they're not terrible, but it's a lot of isolation basketball. It's a lot of Marquise Noel last year, a lot of Tyler Perry this year, just taking over offensively and being able to be efficient on that end of the court. When you talk about one of the things that Louisville fans want to see is some direction on the offensive side of the court. Actually, probably more so the defensive side, which would probably be another score in the win column for Tang, is that Tang is a very good defensive coach. But you need an offensive coordinator if you hire a guy like Jerome Tang, because in his first 2 seasons at Kansas State, it's been a lot of hero ball, a lot of isolation ball. Many Kansas State fans, one thing that I like to do when it comes to learning about the offensive and defensive tendencies, and this is sort of a very fine line to toe here, is see what the fan base thinks, because they watch it every single game, as opposed to me that has to resort to breakdown videos on YouTube or go back and watch full games against solid competition. It's small sample size. I want to see what insiders and media think from the side of covering said coach, covering said team on a regular basis. And there has been a running joke that Jerome Tang doesn't run an offense. Now, obviously, that's likely not the case. The offense is being ran, but it sheds some light on the inconsistency, the lack of concrete, successful plays, sets, you name it. I think that the concern for me here is that Tang would need a solid offensive coordinator to be successful on the offensive end, because you can be a great recruiter, you can be a great defensive coach, you can be great in the aspect of player development, but you also need the ability to draw up offensive plays. We overlooked it with Rick Pitino because he's won national championships. He is a Hall of Famer, one of the best coaches to ever do it in college basketball. But offensively speaking, Jerome Tang, there are some worries there. He's not the youngest guy. He doesn't have a ton of head coaching experience. People wonder if last year was the flash in the pan. No seasons with single-digit losses, so people view this as more of a risk than other candidates because of the unknown. So I think you'll be an exciting hire, but I do acknowledge that there are legitimate concerns that would serve as risks that would concern me a little bit. So, but it's hard to tell if Tang is a legitimate candidate or not. So that's something to focus on. And we'll see over the next week, couple weeks, if his name gets thrown into the mix. But at this point, I think he's probably on the outside looking in. But on the next couple of episodes, we'll talk about Pat Kelsey, Josh Scherz, why Billy Donovan and Jay Wright are unlikely, and more. So be sure to tune in. That's going to wrap up this episode of the Locked on Louisville podcast. Everyone have a great start to your week. We'll see you right back here